The night the vow was broken, winter lay thick over Loch Dew, pressing the village into an uneasy stillness. Snow had fallen without pause since dusk, smoothing the cobbled streets and sealing doors and windows as neatly as wax. By morning it seemed nothing could have moved without leaving a mark. That was why the discovery at number 12 Shaw Street unsettled everyone so deeply. Morag Macivor had been found dead just after dawn, seated upright in her front parlour chair, her hands folded in her lap as if waiting for company. There was no blood, no sign of a struggle, no overturned furniture. The fire had burned low but steady all night, and the kettle still sat warm on the hob. Her front door was locked from the inside, the key resting on the hall table. The back door was bolted. Every window was latched, their sills buried beneath an unbroken crust of snow. To the villagers peering in from the street, it looked less like a murder and more like a carefully staged farewell. Morag had been a quiet woman, widowed young, known for keeping her promises with near-religious seriousness. Every hogmanay, she renewed the same vow she had made decades earlier at her wedding, to keep faith, no matter the season. This year, she had marked the vow in her diary the night before she died, writing the words with unusual force, the pen digging deep enough to tear the paper. Beneath the entry lay the baffling detail that would soon confound the police, a shard of broken ice, carefully wrapped in a handkerchief and placed beside the book. The local constable, who arrived first, could make nothing of it. The ice had not melted, despite the warmth of the room, as though it had been taken from somewhere unnaturally cold. There were no footprints outside except Morag's own, half buried from the evening before, leading to her door and nowhere else. No poison was found in her tea, no marks on her body to suggest violence. The doctor, after a brief examination, could only say that her heart had stopped suddenly, though the look on her face was not peaceful. Her eyes were open, fixed on the fireplace, wide with something like shock. Whispers spread faster than the snow cleared. Some said Morag had been frightened to death. Others insisted she had invited someone in and sworn the constable to secrecy before locking the door herself. A few darker voices spoke of old grudges and broken promises, dredging up memories Morag had never shared aloud, yet nothing fit. A woman does not die of fear with a locked door and no intruder, and grudges do not leave behind ice that refuses to melt. By midday, word reached the police station that Hamish Macbeth was on his way back from a neighbouring village. He arrived just as the light began to fade, his boots crunching softly through the snow, his expression thoughtful rather than alarmed. He listened to the account in silence, then stepped into the parlour and stood very still, as if the room itself was speaking to him. His gaze lingered on the diary, the wrapped shard of ice, and the untouched chair opposite Morag's own. "This isn't unsolvable," Hamish murmured at last, more to himself than to anyone else. "It just wants you to believe it is." Outside, the winter wind rose, rattling the windows of a house that, by all appearances, had never been opened at all. Hamish Macbeth moved about Morag Macivor's parlour with the quiet patience of a man afraid of startling the truth. The constable hovered near the door, notebook ready, while the doctor and a pair of villagers watched with the anxious curiosity of people who hoped the mystery might explain itself if stared at long enough. Hamish ignored them all. He crouched by the hearth, running a finger along the cold edge of the grate, then straightened and glanced at the window. The snow outside lay pristine, a white sheet unmarked by boot or paw, yet the lower sash bore a faint smear, as though something damp had brushed against it from within. He crossed the room and picked up the handkerchief beside the diary. It was linen, neatly ironed, embroidered with a small blue thistle in one corner. When he unfolded it, the shard of ice gleamed faintly in the firelight. It was clear as glass, unnaturally solid, its edges sharp rather than softened by melt. Hamish held it a moment longer than comfort allowed, feeling the cold bite into his skin. Then he set it down carefully. "This didn't come from outside," he said at last. The constable frowned. "It's winter, Hamish. Ice is everywhere." "Aye, but not like this," Hamish replied, "and not kept beside a warm fire all night without turning to water." He turned his attention to the diary. The final entry was brief, written just before midnight. The vow was there, as expected, but something else caught his eye. A faint indentation beneath the words, as though another page had once been pressed hard against it. Hamish flipped back and found the missing sheet torn out cleanly. The constable admitted he hadn't noticed. It had seemed natural enough for an old woman to remove a page she no longer needed. Hamish stood and looked at the empty chair facing Morag's. "Did anyone see her yesterday evening, Mrs. Calder passed her near the pier," the constable said. Morag looked troubled. "Wouldn't stop to talk." Hamish nodded and went to the door. Outside, the villagers parted as he stepped into the pale winter light. Mrs. Calder, bundled in wool and nerves, flinched when he addressed her. She insisted Morag had been alone, but her eyes darted toward the harbour as she spoke, and her gloved hands worried at a loose thread. Hamish thanked her gently, but the unease lingered. Back inside, he asked about visitors. None had been reported. Morag had no close kin, no known enemies. Yet the chair opposite hers bore a slight scuff on one leg, as if it had been dragged closer to the fire and then pushed back again. Hamish tested it with his foot. It rocked faintly, uneven. Someone heavier than Morag had sat there. The constable began listing routine possibilities, natural causes, perhaps fright brought on by loneliness, but Hamish shook his head. He picked up the kettle and sniffed the spout. Plain water. He examined the cups on the dresser. One bore a faint crack along the rim, recent enough to catch his nail. "Someone was here," Hamish said quietly. "Someone she trusted enough to let in before locking the door." "But there are no footprints," the constable protested. Hamish glanced again at the window smear, then at the ice. "Not every guest comes and goes by the ground," he said, "and not every promise is meant to be kept." As dusk fell, the fire crackled and the room seemed to draw in on itself, holding secrets tight. Hamish stepped back into the cold, his mind already moving ahead. The first lie had shown its face, and though he could not yet name it, he knew one thing for certain. Morag Mac Ivor's winter vow had not been broken by accident. The next morning Hamish returned to the village hall, where several villagers had gathered to speak with the constable. The room smelled faintly of peat smoke and boiled cabbage, a comfort to some and a distraction to others. Hamish sat quietly at the edge of the circle, letting the chatter rise and fall before speaking, listening more than asking. It was the silences, he knew, that often betrayed the truth. First came Mrs. Calder, still flushed from the cold. She repeated her account of seeing Morag near the pier, adding now that the widow had seemed anxious, glancing over her shoulder as if expecting someone. "I swear, Hamish," she insisted, "she didn't speak to a soul after I saw her. Not one." Yet her fingers fidgeted with the buttons of her coat, tugging them repeatedly, and Hamish noticed the seam of her sleeve bore a faint streak of mud. She had been outside more recently than she admitted, or so it seemed. Next, Donald Mackey, the local grocer, shuffled forward. He claimed to have delivered Morag's supplies that evening, and insisted she had been cheerful, humming as she unpacked. Yet Hamish remembered the diary entry, the tear of urgency in her handwriting. Cheerful, Hamish murmured to himself, or merely polite. Donald's eyes flicked to the floor as he spoke of Morag's routine, as if rehearsing lines he had told others before. Hamish made a note. Then Mrs. Calder's neighbour, young Fiona Ross, offered her version. She had seen a shadow at Morag's window, though she insisted it had been the wind playing tricks on the curtains. "I know what I saw," she said, her voice trembling, "but I can't be sure." Hamish watched her closely. The tremor in her voice was more than fear. It was calculation. Something about the way she avoided eye contact made him suspect she knew more than she let on. Finally, the constable called in Alec Bremner, the fisherman who occasionally helped Morag with heavy chores. Alec's story was plain-spoken. He had dropped by to check on the widow after the first snowstorm, found the house locked, and left. Yet he added a detail no one else had noticed. The scent of peat smoke in the hall had a faint metallic undertone. "Not that it's anything," he said quickly. "Just a smell I noticed." Hamish lifted an eyebrow. Everyone else had mentioned smoke, but no one spoke of the sharp tang Alec described. A subtle clue, perhaps, or a slip, meant to draw attention away from something more important. Hamish leaned back, letting the pieces swirl in his mind. The villagers' statements were polite, almost rehearsed, yet each contained a fragment that didn't quite fit. Mrs. Calder's eagerness, Donald's rehearsed cheerfulness, Fiona's trembling deflection, Alec's odd sensory detail, they were threads waiting to be woven into a pattern. He noticed how the villagers glanced at one another, a subtle tension under polite conversation, as if testing what each would reveal. "Who last saw her alive?" Hamish asked, his tone casual but piercing. "Just me," Mrs. Calder answered quickly. "I told you." "And no one else?" he pressed. There was a pause, and in it, Fiona's gaze darted toward the door, and Alec's hand flexed around his coat pocket as if considering something. The small contradictions, the micro-movements, they spoke louder than words. Hamish made a mental note of the subtleties, the eagerness to please, the hesitation to reveal, the instinctive gestures that hinted at secrets. By midday, the room felt smaller, the walls pressing in with unspoken truths. Hamish rose and let his eyes sweep over the villagers, his mind already threading the inconsistencies together. Each voice carried a trace of deception, and though the full picture was not yet clear, he knew the frost of winter had settled not just on the village, but over lies long buried, waiting to be uncovered. The first layer of pretense had been peeled away, revealing a network of half-truths, and Hamish sensed that the next step would bring him closer to the heart of Morag Mac Ivor's broken winter vow. Hamish spent the afternoon retracing the steps of each witness, moving from house to house, quietly observing the rhythms of Loch Dhu under the relentless winter sky. The village seemed serene, but beneath the snow-laden calm a lattice of tensions threaded every door and window. He began with Mrs. Calder, whose nervous eagerness in the hall had suggested more than casual curiosity. Her home was modest, neat, and entirely free of signs that she had been anywhere near Morag's house during the night, yet the small smear of mud on her sleeve nagged at him. He asked about her errands, her routine, anything to fix her alibi. She spoke truthfully enough about the market and the errands she had run, but she hesitated when he mentioned Morag's vow. That hesitation was slight, almost imperceptible, but enough to hint that she had an emotional investment in its keeping, or breaking. Next, Hamish considered Donald Mackie. The grocer's life revolved around commerce, and Morag had long been a regular customer. Yet greed was rarely overt. In Loch Dhu, it whispered in the margin of debts and favours owed. Donald's story of Morag's cheerfulness had been rehearsed, and Hamish now wondered whether it concealed irritation over some unpaid bill or an unmet expectation. In his ledger, Hamish scribbled a note. Small debts, small resentments, often the seedbed of mischief when combined with opportunity. Fiona Ross, the young neighbour, was a more tangled thread. Her proximity to Morag's home gave her access, and her nervous deflection during questioning suggested a secret she wished to keep hidden. Hamish walked past her window later that afternoon, and noticed a faint chalk mark on the doorstep, likely nothing to anyone else but significant to him. A hidden signal? A mark to track someone's movement? He filed the observation mentally. It would matter when connected to motive. Alec Bremner, the fisherman, was the final piece of the puzzle for the day. His explanation of the metallic tang in the peat smoke, coupled with his casual mention of helping Morag with chores, hinted at something deeper. Could he have resented a favour he had done without proper acknowledgement? Or perhaps he feared Morag knew more than she should about his dealings. Hamish weighed the angles carefully. Fear could compel silence, or it could drive action of a far more sinister nature. As he traced each suspect's possible intentions, Hamish realized that no single theory could account for every detail of the strange tableau in Morag's parlour. The ice shard, the locked doors, the missing diary page, the faint scuffs on the chair, all pointed to a careful orchestration that demanded both access and motive. Yet all 4 villagers could plausibly have been involved, each from a different angle. Mrs. Calder's hidden anxiety hinted at personal stakes. Donald Mackey's practiced demeanour suggested financial tension. Fiona's deflection betrayed a secret she might guard with cunning. Alec's peculiar observations suggested knowledge he had yet to reveal. Hamish returned to the crime scene as dusk settled once more. In the firelight he paced slowly, imagining the events that night. Footsteps that should have left prints, gestures that should have been seen, actions that did not fit neatly into the expected sequence. He sketched diagrams in his mind, mapping relationships and opportunities, the web of motives stretching taut. Each person had something to gain or fear to lose, yet the full picture remained elusive. One thread, he thought, would unravel the rest, if only he could find it. By nightfall the village had slipped into a quiet frost. Hamish leaned against the doorway of Morag's home, watching the snowflakes twist in the lantern light. The motives were many, overlapping and conflicting, but they formed a pattern in his mind, a maze that, when traced correctly, would lead not only to the truth of her death, but to the unravelling of the lies that had kept it hidden. Somewhere among greed, fear, secrecy, and jealousy lay the key, and Hamish, patient as winter itself, would find it. The following morning the village buzzed with a false sense of triumph. A young constable had discovered a half-burned letter tucked into Morag's fireplace, its edges curled black, the words still legible enough to suggest that someone had threatened her in writing. The authorities pounced on it immediately, convinced that the mystery had found its answer. The letter, signed with an indistinct flourish, warned Morag that breaking an old promise would have consequences. The constable rushed to announce that the case was nearly solved, eyes gleaming with self-satisfaction. Hamish, however, remained quiet. He examined the letter under the cold light of the winter morning, tilting it to catch the angles of its burn marks. The paper was unevenly scorched, yet the pattern of the burning seemed deliberate rather than accidental. Someone had wanted it to be found, and that someone had ensured it looked like a confession or a threat. Hamish frowned. The handwriting was intentionally vague, the signature almost comically indecipherable. It was clever, almost too clever, and that alone made him wary. The constable, emboldened by what he assumed was a breakthrough, began visiting the villagers with the letter in hand, pressing them for confessions, or at least explanations. Mrs. Calder shook her head vigorously, insisting she had never seen it before. Donald Mackey maintained his rehearsed cheerfulness, claiming that if anyone wanted to scare Morag, he had no part in it. Fiona Ross wrung her hands nervously but offered only vague denials, while Alec Bremner watched the proceedings with a casual air that seemed almost too relaxed, as though the letter confirmed what he had long suspected. Hamish, meanwhile, revisited Morag's diary and the shard of ice. The letter didn't explain either of these. It didn't account for the locked door or the faint smear on the window. If anything, the letter had been planted to divert attention, a smoke signal for those who might look too closely. He carefully laid out the diary, the ice, the scuffed chair, and the half-burned letter in a neat line on the table. The pieces didn't quite fit together the way the authorities assumed. Something about the arrangement felt like a staged scene, a puzzle designed to mislead. By late afternoon, word had spread through the village that the case was nearly solved. Relief rippled through some faces, but Hamish noticed how others, especially Fiona, watched from the shadows, tense, calculating, as if they were measuring the constable's confidence against their own secrets. Hamish stepped outside, letting the cold bite at his cheeks, and observed the subtle behaviours, furtive glances, hesitant footsteps, small gestures of concealment. The letter, meant to signal closure, had instead revealed fissures, cracks in the narrative the authorities refused to see. Hamish returned to the parlour, eyes drawn once again to the ice shard. The coldness of it seemed unnatural, almost deliberate. He held it in his hand, feeling the chill sink into his palm, and realised that whoever had orchestrated this had anticipated the village's assumptions. The letter was bait, and someone was watching to see how eagerly the trap had been accepted. The real criminal, he thought, had no need to strike yet. They could wait, comfortable in the chaos they had created, confident that the authorities would celebrate a premature victory. As dusk settled, the fire flickered low in the hearth, and Hamish paced slowly, piecing together the web of motives and contradictions he had collected. The warmth of the room contrasted with the cold precision of the deception laid before him. He understood now that the case was far from solved. The letter had been a brilliant distraction, a false victory meant to lull the village and the police into complacency. And somewhere in the shadowed corners of Loch Dhu, the true architect of Morag MacIvor's broken winter vow waited, ready to exploit the missteps of those who thought they had unravelled the mystery. Hamish's gaze drifted to the diary once more, then to the empty chair opposite Morag's. The room felt alive with secrets, each one whispering in its own way. He knew the breakthrough everyone celebrated was a mirage, and the real challenge, the one that would require patience, subtlety, and cunning, was just beginning. Hamish returned to the quiet of his small office above the village post, the fire casting a steady glow as he spread out his notes, sketches, and observations. The letter, the shard of ice, the scuffed chair, the diary. All of it had a certain immediacy, but he knew the present alone could not hold the key. Cases like this often had roots that ran deeper than the surface, tangled in old grievances, forgotten promises, and secrets long ignored. He pulled the ledger from Morag's personal accounts and leafed through it carefully. Among the mundane records of groceries and small debts, a pattern emerged, repeated payments to Donald Mackie over many years, modest in some but consistent, almost ritualistic. Nothing criminal, certainly, but a tie nonetheless, a string that connected two lives in a way not obvious to the casual observer. He remembered Fiona Ross's deflections and unease during questioning, and began looking through village records of births, marriages, and deaths, tracing familial lines. A quiet gasp slipped from him as he noticed a link. Fiona's late mother had been a distant cousin of Morag's, estranged after a falling out over a property dispute decades ago. The connection was subtle, barely noticeable, but it explained why Fiona's movements had always skirted the edges of Morag's routines. She was not just a curious neighbour, she had a personal stake in the family's history, one that could simmer in silence for years. Even more striking was Alec Bremner's connection. Hamish cross-referenced old fishing permits and land leases, and discovered that Alec's father had once held a minor claim to Morag's property, relinquished only under protest after a small but bitter dispute. Alec had never openly acknowledged it, but the resentment could easily have passed down through generations, festering quietly in the background. The seemingly innocuous fisherman, helpful and friendly on the surface, was now part of a network of historical grievances intersecting with Morag's life in ways the villagers had long forgotten. Hamish leaned back and let his eyes travel over the sketches of the parlour once more. The scuffed chair, the smear on the window, the shard of ice, they were no longer isolated anomalies. Viewed through the lens of the past, they became instruments in a story that had been written long ago, its final chapter unfolding now under the snow and winter chill. The village's false sense of security, built around the half-burned letter, dissolved in his mind. This was not a random act of opportunism or a simple dispute. It was the slow, deliberate unravelling of old tensions, old grudges meticulously orchestrated. He thought of Mrs. Calder, too, whose eagerness and anxiety had seemed minor but now hinted at a deeper involvement. Perhaps she had been a messenger of sorts, or a witness persuaded to look the other way, caught up in the inherited web of resentment and secrecy. the strands of motive and connection, once separate, now wove together, a lattice invisible to those who saw only the surface. As twilight descended, Hamish gathered the key artifacts, the diary, the ice, the letter. Each bore silent witness to a past that had been hidden, almost erased by time, but now thrust forward into the cold present. The true nature of Morag Mac Ivor's broken winter vow was becoming clear, not merely a victim of circumstance, but a node in a network of historical grievances and concealed alliances. The crime was not a sudden act of passion or malice, it was the inevitable eruption of old tensions, played out with the precision of someone who understood every angle, every weakness. Hamish stood, boots crunching softly against the snow outside, and allowed the winter wind to carry away the warmth of the office. The village, silent and unsuspecting beneath the frosted sky, was blind to the forces that had converged within it. Somewhere among those he had questioned, and perhaps beyond, the architect of Morag's fate lingered. Past and present intertwined, and only by following the threads of history could Hamish hope to illuminate the shadowy figure who had orchestrated this tragedy with patience and cunning. Hamish returned to Morag Mac Ivor's parlour the following morning, carrying with him a small kit he rarely needed, magnifying lens, notepad, and a tiny vial of soot collected from the hearth. He had decided that the ordinary methods of questioning and observation would no longer suffice. The web of motives and past grudges was too intricate to unravel through logic alone. Sometimes, he thought, the human mind reveals itself in the smallest reactions, in the minutiae of attention and hesitation. He began by recounting aloud the sequence of events as he understood them: the shard of ice, the scuffed chair, the half-burned letter, the missing diary page. He spoke not to the constable or the villagers, who had gathered reluctantly, but to the room itself, as if coaxing it to testify. Then, casually, he mentioned a detail that had not yet been disclosed to anyone outside his own observations: the faint metallic tang in the peat smoke, as Alec Bremner had noted. At once, Alec's face twitched almost imperceptibly. His hand, which had been resting lightly on the table, tightened around the edge of his coat. He inhaled sharply and blinked, just once too many, before attempting a forced nonchalance. Hamish paused, watching, giving the effect of ignoring the reaction entirely. The tiny movement had spoken louder than words. A subtle crack had appeared in Alec's practised calm. Hamish stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You mentioned the smoke, Alec," he said gently. "Quite unusual to notice, wouldn't you agree?" Alec shifted his weight, glancing at the window, then back to the floor. "It's nothing," he murmured. "Just something I thought might be odd." Hamish smiled faintly. "Odd indeed. Especially when no one else noticed it. You have a good nose for detail, I hear." The compliment was casual, almost incidental, but it carried weight. Alec's response was immediate, a half smile that didn't reach his eyes, followed by a nervous clearing of the throat. Hamish moved to the diary, lifting the remaining pages. "And the missing page? Surely that drew your attention, yes?" He allowed his eyes to linger on Alec, gauging his reaction. The fisherman's hands twitched slightly, brushing a speck of soot from his sleeve, and his gaze dropped to the floor. That twitch, Hamish knew, was an instinctive effort to conceal recognition, the kind that betrays knowledge one would rather hide. Turning his attention to the shard of ice, Hamish held it up between his fingers, letting the light glint off its sharp edges. "Frozen all night, though the fire burned bright," he said, letting the observation hang. One would think that, without intervention, it would have melted long before dawn, but it remained. Curious, don't you agree? Alec's eyes darted briefly toward the shard, then back to Hamish. A flicker of guilt, or perhaps fear, passed over his face, almost imperceptible, but enough to confirm what Hamish suspected. He had more knowledge of that night than he had yet admitted. The others in the room were unaware of the significance, but Hamish's quiet, methodical drawing of attention to details only the guilty or the well-informed would respond to had begun to work. Hamish straightened, pocketing the ice. "Small things matter," he said softly, addressing no one in particular. "The smallest movement, a word, a glance. These reveal more than confession ever could." He watched Alec carefully, noting how the subtle cracks in composure widened imperceptibly, how the weight of hidden knowledge bent the shoulders just a fraction. By the time the villagers had departed, murmuring to themselves and reassured by their own sense of progress, Hamish remained. The unconventional clue, the psychological test of observing a reaction rather than extracting a statement, had succeeded. Alec Bremner, calm and friendly to all appearances, had inadvertently revealed a fissure in his own story, and Hamish knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his chest, that the next step would follow from that fracture, leading him closer to the truth behind Morag Mac Ivor's broken winter vow. The next morning, Hamish returned to the parlour with a renewed sense of focus, intending to examine the shard of ice and the diary more closely. He found the room empty, the fire cold, and the air sharp with a lingering scent of peat. But as he approached the table, his heart sank. The diary was gone. Not misplaced, not tucked away, but entirely absent. The pages he had studied, the careful notes on Morag's vow, and the torn sheet that hinted at hidden knowledge, had vanished. A shock of anger and disbelief ran through him, but he forced himself to remain calm. Whoever had taken the diary had done so with purpose, knowing its significance. They had stolen not just paper and ink, but the tangible thread connecting motive, opportunity, and deception. Hamish crouched by the fireplace, scanning for other signs, scuff marks, footprints, disturbances, but the snow outside the windows remained pristine, untouched by human passage since dawn. Whoever had taken it had been careful, deliberate, almost ghost-like in execution. He considered the possibilities. Mrs. Calder had seemed anxious, yet her movements had been monitored. Fiona had the familial connection, but no indication she had ventured inside the house overnight. Donald Mackie had motive, but no demonstrated access. Alec Bremner, however, the flicker of guilt from yesterday still fresh in Hamish's mind, remained the one whose knowledge of the ice, the missing diary page, and the metallic tang in the smoke suggested he could navigate unnoticed where others could not. Hamish let his thoughts settle and then called in the constable. Together they retraced the steps of the previous day, examining windows, doors, and any conceivable entry point. Nothing appeared disturbed. It was as though the diary had vanished into the thin winter air, carried off by someone with patience and cunning equal to the careful orchestration of Morag's death. He stepped outside, the wind biting through his coat, and looked across the street where the village lay still beneath a thin crust of ice. The disappearance of the diary elevated the stakes. What had been a web of clues, now partially erased, was suddenly more fragile, more dangerous. Whoever had removed the evidence was not merely covering tracks. They were actively shaping the investigation, steering suspicion, and controlling the narrative. The game had grown far more complex than a simple unravelling of motives. Someone was playing a long, meticulous match against him. Returning to the parlour, Hamish noted the shard of ice still sitting in its place, undisturbed, as though left intentionally. A cruel signal, perhaps. Part of the puzzle remained, but the crucial piece had been removed. The pattern was deliberate, the manipulation precise. It was a warning, a reminder that the truth could not be taken for granted, and that trust in appearances, of the villagers, the evidence, even his own assumptions, was now dangerously precarious. Hamish allowed himself a moment of reflection, eyes narrowing on the empty space where the diary had rested. Whoever had taken it wanted him to pause, to doubt, to misstep. Yet he also recognized the opportunity hidden within the theft. A careful observer could deduce much from what was removed, from the timing, and from the manner in which it was carried out. That knowledge, subtle though it might be, could illuminate the hand behind the deception. By evening, He walked the village paths again, boots crunching against the frozen snow, observing the subtle exchanges between neighbours, the fleeting glances, the whispered warnings. Trust had become a fragile thing indeed. A single misstep, a single misinterpreted look, could shift suspicion wildly. Hamish knew that the thief, emboldened by their temporary advantage, would continue to manipulate events, but he also knew that patience, attention to detail, and the subtle cracks revealed by human behaviour could still turn the tide. The diary might be gone, but the story it contained, and the truth it hinted at, were not beyond reach. Somewhere, in the tension of unspoken words and unnoticed gestures, the next clue waited. The chill of the evening had settled over Loch Dew when Hamish returned to his small office, intent on reviewing his notes and piecing together the movements of the villagers. But before he could sit, a hurried knock sounded at the door. It was the constable, face pale, breath ragged from the cold. "Hamish." "It's Alec," he said, voice tight. "He's gone. His boat. It's empty at the pier." Hamish's heart sank. Alec Bremner, the man whose subtle reactions had revealed hidden knowledge, was now missing. He grabbed his coat, stepping into the biting wind, following the constable down to the harbour. The wooden pier was slick with ice, and the small fishing boat floated silently, untethered, rocking gently against the frozen water. No footprints led to it, no sign of struggle, nothing to indicate whether Alec had fled, been taken, or worse. Hamish crouched at the edge of the pier, studying the boat. The oars were neatly stacked, the nets folded with care, and the tiny cabin door closed. The precision suggested that whoever had orchestrated this disappearance was methodical, perhaps waiting for the right moment to make Alec vanish entirely from view, leaving no clue behind. A second thought struck him. The disappearance mirrored the theft of the diary. The same hand, he realized, was at work, manipulating events, removing key pieces and staying just out of reach. The constable shook his head. "No note, no sign, just gone." Hamish's eyes scanned the harbour, noting the snowdrifts, the shadows cast by the lanterns, the faint tracks of a dog that had wandered earlier, now disappearing under fresh frost. He stood slowly, feeling the pattern emerge. The criminal was not acting out of impulse. These were deliberate moves, a strategy meant to unsettle and misdirect. First the diary, now Alec. Each act forced the investigation to pivot, to chase shadows while the true culprit observed from the edges, several steps ahead. Hamish returned to the village, retracing the moments before Alec's disappearance. He recalled the flicker in Alec's eyes when the shard of ice and the diary page had been discussed, the slight twitches, the half-smile of unease. Alec had known more than he admitted, but knowing too much had now made him vulnerable. Whoever was orchestrating this wanted the knowledge suppressed, or perhaps planned to use Alec as a pawn in a larger scheme. By nightfall, Hamish found himself back at Morag's empty parlour, staring at the hearth where the ice shard had gleamed. The room felt colder than before, heavier, charged with unspoken menace. The patterns he had traced over days, the motives, the grudges, the subtle connections between villagers, now intertwined with Alec's disappearance. The investigation was no longer merely about unravelling Morag's death. It had escalated into a race to anticipate the next move, to prevent another tragedy, and to see beyond the carefully constructed illusions the criminal had set in place. Hamish's mind worked quickly, mapping possibilities, testing scenarios against the known behaviours of those involved. Someone in Loch Dew had the patience and cunning to manipulate not just events but perceptions, shaping the investigation itself. The disappearance of Alec Bremner proved that the villain was agile, adaptive, and watching every step. Hamish clenched his hands, feeling the stakes sharpen. It was no longer enough to react. He needed to anticipate, to think 3 steps ahead, and to trust in the subtle signs that had guided him this far. Outside, the winter wind carried whispers across the frozen village streets. Footsteps seemed heavier, shadows darker, and in the hush of Loch Dhu, Hamish understood that the next act could erupt at any moment. The villain was still several moves ahead, but for the first time, Hamish felt the faint pulse of opportunity. The threads of motive, history, and deception were still in place, and if he could read them correctly, he might yet prevent a second tragedy, and finally corner the architect of Morag Mac Ivor's broken winter vow. Spent the following morning walking the quiet streets of Loch Dhu, the snow underfoot crisp and unbroken, the village almost serene in contrast to the tension that hummed beneath the surface. He reviewed everything again, moving through each observation, each subtle twitch, every contradiction and hesitation he had recorded over the past week. The stolen diary, Alec's disappearance, the half-burned letter. They were all pieces of a puzzle that now seemed almost impossible to solve. Yet Hamish knew that in chaos, patterns often revealed themselves in the smallest of details. He returned to Morag Mac Ivor's house, careful not to disturb anything further. Standing in the parlour, he surveyed the room with new eyes, considering not just the obvious clues, but the ones he had set aside. The shard of ice still resting where he had left it, the faint smear on the window, the slight unevenness in the scuff marks of the chair legs. Then he noticed something he had passed over before, a small indentation in the hearthstone, partially covered by soot, as if a weighty object had once been pressed against it. On its own, it had seemed trivial, almost a manufacturing flaw in the fireplace. Now it seemed deliberate. Hamish crouched and brushed away the soot carefully, revealing the impression of a square base, just large enough to hold a small box. His mind ticked over the significance. The diary had vanished, Alec had disappeared, and the half-burned letter had been planted. The culprit had been working in plain sight, manipulating the room to conceal the truth, and the indentation indicated a deliberate location, somewhere the criminal had staged or hidden something critical. His thoughts drifted to the villagers and the subtle behaviours that had punctuated the investigation. Alec's twitch, Fiona's nervous deflection, Mrs. Calder's eagerness. They had all responded to cues that, on reflection, pointed back to the hearth. Perhaps it had been Alec himself, the one who had inadvertently revealed too much, who had been used to manipulate the investigation. Hamish's eyes scanned the room again, and landed on the hearth mantel, where a small, almost invisible notch seemed to match the indentation below. The pattern emerged in his mind, the placement of objects, the timing of events, the subtle manipulations of behaviour. They were all choreographed around the room itself. The shard of ice, left deliberately, mirrored the cold precision with which the criminal had acted. The diary's removal ensured confusion. Alec's disappearance created fear and distraction, and the hearthstone, overlooked by everyone, held the central clue that tied these events together. Hamish knelt, gently tapping the hearthstone at the edges. There was a hollow sound. Carefully, he lifted the stone, revealing a small cavity beneath. Inside lay the missing diary page, folded neatly, along with a second shard of ice, smaller but identical to the first. The key detail that had been hiding in plain sight, overlooked by the authorities and the villagers alike, suddenly illuminated the careful orchestration of the crime. He leaned back, letting the realization settle. The criminal had not merely acted on impulse. The pattern of theft, disappearance, and subtle psychological manipulation had been planned meticulously, using objects and behaviour to misdirect and control. Yet by tracing the smallest, most innocuous detail, the indentation in the hearthstone, Hamish had begun to see the full choreography of the deception. Outside, the village remained silent under the blanket of snow, but Hamish now felt the rhythm of the crime, the calculated moves that had been hidden in plain sight. He tucked the diary page and the second shard carefully into his coat pocket. The pattern was clear, and with it the next step in unmasking the architect of Morag Mac Ivor's broken winter vow was no longer a question of possibility, it was inevitable. The truth, once obscured by misdirection and fear, was finally coming into view. Hamish sat quietly in the parlour, the recovered diary page spread before him, the two shards of ice catching the firelight. Every tiny observation, the subtle smears, the misplaced scuffs, the reactions of the villagers, suddenly aligned, forming a picture that had eluded him until now. The crime was no longer a tangle of petty grudges or old debts. It was something far darker, far more personal. He thought first of Alec Bremner. The disappearance, the subtle cracks in his composure, the knowledge of the ice and the diary page, all of it had pointed to a deeper connection. As Hamish traced the patterns of behaviour, he realised Alec was not the architect, only a pawn in a plan that ran far deeper into the village's past. The true culprit had orchestrated every move with precision, manipulating not just evidence but the minds of those around them. The revelation hit him with a sudden clarity. Morag MacIvor's winter vow, her decades-long promise, was more than a personal ritual. It represented the preservation of a secret, a truth buried so long that the villagers had almost forgotten it. Years ago, a scandal had fractured part of the community, an illicit relationship, a hidden inheritance, a betrayal that had been hushed and buried beneath courtesy and civility. Morag had been a guardian of that secret, entrusted with knowledge that could unravel lives if exposed. Hamish leaned closer to the diary page, reading the carefully folded words. The missing page, removed deliberately, contained notes not just about the vow but about who had been involved in that old scandal. The ice shard had been placed as a psychological signature, a symbol of cold, controlled manipulation. The criminal had acted not for money, not for petty revenge, but to protect, or perhaps exploit, a secret powerful enough to reshape the social order of Lochdu. The pieces of the puzzle fell into place: the planted letter, the staged disappearance of Alec, the calculated theft of the diary, the subtle manipulation of villagers' perceptions. All of it had been designed to keep Morag's secret from coming to light. The level of obsession required, the precision in controlling behaviour and evidence, revealed a mind driven by fear and compulsion, someone who could rationalise extreme acts to maintain control over the past. And then Hamish understood the most shocking part. The person behind it was not motivated by malice alone. It was a need for preservation, a consuming desire to protect their own position in the web of history. They were willing to kill, to manipulate, to disappear evidence, not for gain, but because the truth itself was a threat too dangerous to risk. The psychology of the crime was intricate, fear intertwined with obsession, secrecy twisted into strategy, and personal history leveraged as a weapon. Hamish's eyes moved around the room, imagining the criminal watching, anticipating every move, confident that the maze they had constructed would remain unsolved. But the recovery of the diary page and the recognition of the pattern had exposed their motive in full. The true aim had never been money, status, or vengeance. It had been control over knowledge, over memory, over the narrative itself. The villain's willingness to go to such extremes stemmed from the unbearable possibility that the past, long hidden, could be revealed. Outside, the snow drifted silently over the streets of Lochdu. Inside, the fire crackled low, reflecting the cold precision of the crime. Hamish rose, tucking the evidence carefully into his coat. He had discovered not just what had been done, but why. And understanding the why meant he could predict the next move, anticipate the manipulations, and finally begin to draw the shadowed figure out of hiding. The hidden motive was revealed, and with it the path to uncovering the architect of Morag MacIvor's broken winter vow had become unmistakably clear. Hamish spent the night poring over the recovered diary page, cross-referencing every detail with his notes on villagers' behaviour, old grievances, and the sequence of events. By morning, he felt close to unmasking the criminal. The pieces, the shard of ice, the half-burned letter, Alec's disappearance, the subtle manipulations of Mrs. Calder, Fiona, and Donald, had all been arranged to point to a particular line of reasoning, one that now seemed obvious. The crime had been orchestrated to protect a secret buried deep in Lochdu's history. Confident, he convened the villagers at the hall, intending to confront them and finally resolve the tangled web. Faces turned toward him expectantly, some with relief, some with apprehension. He outlined the pattern, the hidden motives, the psychological manipulation, letting each subtle observation fall into place. As he spoke, nods and murmurs indicated comprehension. Even Alec, safely returned under careful watch, seemed convinced that the culprit would be exposed. Yet Hamish, though outwardly composed, noticed something he had overlooked in the rush of the reconstruction, a subtle misalignment in the story of Mrs. Calder. She had been anxious, eager to assist, and yet her knowledge of Morag's past, of the long-buried family quarrel, was far more precise than anyone had expected. She had mentioned, in passing, an offhand detail about the original feud that neither the diary nor any other villager had supplied. A tiny slip, almost imperceptible but enough to give Hamish pause. He turned toward her slowly, voice calm but probing. "Mrs. Calder," he began, "you spoke of the quarrel between families years ago. Curious that you know the precise sequence of events, down to the day and the individuals involved." Her eyes widened, a flash of recognition passing across her face, but she forced a polite smile. "Oh, Hamish, it's just village gossip," she said lightly. "Everyone knows about it." Hamish shook his head gently. "Not everyone knows the details you just mentioned, and yet you have referenced them naturally, without hesitation. One could almost assume a familiarity with the events that goes beyond mere rumour." The room shifted uncomfortably, a tension rising as the villagers sensed the detective's focus narrowing. Her composure cracked ever so slightly. A hand trembled on her shawl, and her gaze flicked toward the corner of the room, as if searching for an escape. It was the faintest gesture, but to Hamish it spoke volumes. The careful manipulations of the diary theft, Alec's disappearance, the planted ice and letter, they all had been orchestrated under her watchful eye, guided by knowledge only she possessed. "You were careful," Hamish continued, pacing slowly. "You allowed others to act as pawns, to be observed and misled. You planted diversions, removed evidence, and created fear. All to protect something you knew had to remain hidden, not for money, not for petty revenge, but to safeguard a secret from the past, one that could unravel the village if revealed." Mrs. Calder swallowed, lips pressed tight, and finally exhaled, a shiver passing through her as if she had been holding back more than just words. The entire hall seemed to tense, recognizing the subtle revelation. The mastermind, the person everyone had overlooked in favor of more obvious suspects, had been the quiet, eager helper all along, hiding in plain sight. Hamish stepped back, letting the truth settle. The final twist, the last misdirection, had been hers. The real architect of Morag Mac Ivor's broken winter vow had never needed to appear threatening, had only needed patience, subtlety, and intimate knowledge. And though the case had almost reached its conclusion, it had taken one overlooked detail, one imperceptible slip, to reveal the full genius and danger of the mind behind it. Outside, Lochdu lay still beneath a pale winter sky, but inside the hall the tension hung like frost. Hamish knew that unmasking Mrs. Calder was only the beginning. Understanding her mind, predicting her next move, and ensuring no further tragedy would occur would test every ounce of his skill. The last-minute twist had arrived, and with it the final challenge of the case. Hamish held Mrs. Calder's gaze steadily, letting the silence stretch just long enough for the weight of her secret to press upon the room. Finally she spoke, her voice trembling as the carefully maintained composure collapsed. "I didn't mean... I only wanted to protect them," she admitted, the words spilling out faster than she could control. "I never thought anyone would be hurt. I only wanted to keep Morag's secret safe. It was my family. It's always been my family." Hamish nodded, listening as the truth poured forth. The long-buried scandal, the feud that had fractured generations, had been her burden to carry. She had orchestrated the theft of the diary, manipulated the villagers' perceptions, and even leveraged Alec's temporary disappearance, all to prevent the past from surfacing and destabilizing the fragile peace of the village. The shard of ice, the half-burned letter, the misdirection, they had all been her instruments, precise and deliberate. The villagers, still gathered in the hall, murmured among themselves, shocked by the revelation. Some shook their heads, struggling to reconcile the cheerful, eager Mrs. Calder they knew with the calculating hand that had shaped so much chaos. Alec, now safe, looked both relieved and angry, realizing how close he had come to becoming a permanent pawn. Hamish allowed the constable to take Mrs. Calder into custody, ensuring that the situation remained orderly, but he knew that the moral complexities of justice were rarely neat. Later, alone in the parlour, Hamish reconstructed the subtle clues that had led him here. The faint smear of mud on Mrs. Calder's sleeve, a detail everyone had dismissed, hinted at her night-time movements, unnoticed because she was considered harmless. Her casual but precise references to old grievances, buried in conversation, had slipped past the authorities as mere gossip. The shard of ice, carefully positioned, had served as a psychological signature, a symbol of control and cold precision. Or the half-burned letter acted as a diversion to accelerate the false sense of closure. Even Alec's reaction to the discussion of the metallic scent in the peat smoke had been a crucial indicator. He had recognized the manipulation immediately, revealing the orchestrator indirectly. Hamish traced each connection in his mind, seeing how the chaos had been choreographed to appear random and misleading, yet had actually followed a meticulous logic. The criminal's patience, knowledge, and psychological insight had created a web almost impossible to untangle. And yet, by observing the smallest deviations, the tiniest gestures, and the overlooked inconsistencies, he had uncovered the truth. Once more, he had been one step ahead, the hidden patterns revealing the hand behind the crime. Outside, Loch Dhu settled beneath a pale winter sky, quiet now but for the occasional creak of snow-laden branches. There was a sense of relief, yet also unease. The villagers had witnessed not only a crime, but the depths to which human obsession could twist morality and action. Justice had been served in the immediate sense. Mrs. Calder would face the consequences, and the truth of Morag Mac Ivor's broken winter vow was no longer hidden. Yet Hamish knew the emotional undercurrents would linger, the unresolved tensions of past grievances echoing through the community for years to come. He stepped outside, boots crunching on the icy path, and let the cold wind clear his thoughts. The case was concluded, yet it carried a haunting clarity. The human mind, driven by secrecy, fear, or devotion, could orchestrate acts of brilliance and cruelty that blurred the lines of justice. Hamish smiled faintly, a touch of wry admiration in his eyes. The villain had been revealed, the pattern exposed, the evidence accounted for, but the shadow of what might have been, and what might still linger in the quiet corners of Loch Dhu, ensured that even a solved mystery left its mark. Justice was delivered, yes, but in the quiet of winter it was never simple, and it was never entirely complete. Hamish walked slowly through the snow-dusted streets of Loch Dhu, the village finally quiet after the long days of tension and revelation. The villagers had returned to their routines, cautious smiles crossing faces that still carried the weight of the recent drama. Alec had been reassured, Mrs. Calder taken under careful supervision, and the truth of Morag Mac Ivor's broken winter vow had been laid bare. Yet Hamish knew that even as the immediate danger passed, mysteries never truly ended. His boots crunched over the frozen path toward the edge of the village, where the hills met the frosted loch. He let his mind wander over the clues, the stolen diary page, the shard of ice, the half-burned letter, and the subtle gestures of those around him. Each had revealed something, yet something still niggled in the back of his mind. A faint irregularity, a fleeting inconsistency that did not align perfectly with Mrs. Calder's meticulous orchestration. Perhaps it had been nothing, a trick of memory, or perhaps it was the seed of another story, waiting quietly in the shadows to emerge. He paused by the pier, staring at the still waters, half frozen and dark beneath the grey sky. A small scrap of paper caught his eye, partially buried in the snow, fluttering gently with the wind. Hamish bent and picked it up, noting the peculiar handwriting, tiny, precise, unfamiliar. The words were brief, cryptic. "Not all is as it seems. Watch the winter closely." His brow furrowed as he read and reread the message, a chill creeping up his spine despite the cold. It was not addressed to anyone in particular, yet its presence here, so near the site of Alec's disappearance, suggested forethought, intention, and perhaps a new player in the quiet machinations of Loch Dhu. Hamish straightened, tucking the note carefully into his coat pocket. He understood then that even in a solved case, the world remained unpredictable. Someone had wanted him to see that, to recognize that the surface calm could mask undercurrents yet unseen. Perhaps it was a warning, a taunt, or the opening move of another scheme. Whoever left it had knowledge of his methods, and a mind clever enough to suggest that the game was far from over. As he walked back toward the village, Hamish reflected on the lessons of the past week. He had observed, deduced, and anticipated. He had pieced together motives, uncovered hidden connections, and exposed the mastermind who had operated in plain sight. Yet the note reminded him that in detective work certainty was rare, and the unknown ever present. For every truth uncovered, there could be a shadow of a question, a whisper of something more. He passed Morag MacIvor's house one last time, the windows dark, the fire long extinguished, the hearth now cold and empty. Even here, where the past had erupted into tragedy, he felt the lingering presence of secrets yet to be unearthed. The village seemed to breathe around him, quiet but alive, full of ordinary lives that hid extraordinary stories beneath the surface. Hamish raised his gaze to the distant hills, the horizon pale with the approaching dusk. The case of the broken winter vow was concluded, yes, but the faint smile tugging at his lips betrayed his awareness. There would always be another puzzle, another shadow to chase, another mind to outwit. Loch Dhu might seem tranquil now, but mysteries like winter frost seeped quietly into every corner. He had solved one, but the next was always waiting, just out of sight, just beyond the snow. And with that thought, Hamish Macbeth walked onward, boots leaving a crisp trail behind him, the quiet village receding behind, knowing full well that a detective's work was never truly finished, and that some mysteries, no matter how thoroughly unravelled, left a lingering question in the mind, ensuring that the hunt, the intrigue, and the pursuit of truth would continue,